So this is part three in the series we've been doing on rabbis and the plague. We started off in the first shir discussing how Chazal, the rabbis of the Talmud, dealt with epidemics, pandemics, what constituted a pandemic, what they thought about contagious disease, and we really emphasized both that they sort of had a notion of what constituted an epidemic. They had a way of measuring it. That it was, if it was 3 deaths within 3 days in a town of a certain size, or 3 deaths on 3 consecutive days in a town of a certain size. And also for Chazal, even though they recognize that bad things happen to good people, that death from illness wasn't necessarily a punishment, they did think that an epidemic was a reason, should cause us to do some sort of cheshbon and nefesh, and also to do tshuva, that we had to sort of ask ourselves what we should learn from the challenges that we're confronting. Then last week we talked about how Jewish communities responded, especially to the bubonic plague beginning in the 14th century, and then there were waves of the bubonic plague that lasted all the way really up until the 19th century. Up until and even today, there are still outbreaks that occur. Today, it's very treatable because we have antibiotics. But that became a recurring theme in rabbinic literature. Different questions that arose about how to deal with an outbreak of the plague. So this week this will be the final shir in this series, at least for now. So this week we'll talk about responses to the Spanish flu. Right, the last major pandemic before the one we're in now, and also some contemporary shuvot that deal specifically with issues around COVID-19. And finally, one of the reasons, of course, that we don't have epidemics anymore is or as many epidemics anymore, is the rise of vaccines. So we'll also talk about some of the shuvot that deal with vaccines. Okay, but starting from the beginning. So just germ theory, I believe, if I have my sense of medical history correct, develops in the late 19th century. It's not immediately widely accepted. It took some time for it to develop. It was first accepted more in Europe and then also in the US. So 1918, though, the Spanish flu breaks out in the spring. So just to read from the CDC's website, the 1918 influenza pandemic was the most severe pandemic in recent history. It was caused by an H1N1 virus with genes of avian origin. Although there is not a universal consensus regarding where the virus originated, it spread worldwide during 1918 and 1919. In the US, it was first identified in military personnel in spring 1918, and it's estimated that about 500 million people, or 1/3 of the world's population, became infected with this virus. The number of deaths was estimated to be at least 50 million worldwide, with 675,000 deaths occurring in the United States, right? So we're talking death on a very wide scale, very high mortality rate, partly both because of the severity of the flu itself, of the strain of the flu itself, but also because without antibiotics and with a still developing understanding of germ theory, there was no real way of countering sort of the secondary infections that also went along with this. So in the fall of 1918, if you look in papers in North America especially, you see a lot of discussion about 2 things. One, that the war is ending, and also World War I is ending, and also the flu. So this is an article that I found today from the Wahrheit, which is a Yiddish daily that was published in New York, called The Truth, from October 27th, 1918. And they quote, this was actually on the front page, but below the fold. I don't know how anyone's Yiddish is, how good anyone's Yiddish is. Mine is not great. But you can make out here that this is, I believe, a Rav Velvel. I don't think it's the Rav Velvel. I think it's a Rav Velvel that was in New York, who says that you can be Mekel, the second word here, day Shiva, on the days of Shiva, because of the influenza. That's that last word there. And what the article discusses is that he says there are certain leniencies. This was head of one of the Bate Din, one of the rabbinical courts in New York, or in the early 20th century, who's saying that you can be lenient on some of the laws of Shiva because of the flu. And probably the same, both because my Yiddish is poor and because the type on this is not great. I'm guessing, though, it's the same story that appeared in the foreword the next day, which is also then published in Yiddish. But fortunately, I found sort of a summary of what that said. And this summary explains that the head of one of the Bate Din in New York announced that the Jews in mourning who are sitting Shiva can be lenient with regard to the laws of mourning. So that normally, of course, they were required to stay home and do no work or domestic tasks or even change clothes or bathe. However, because of the flu, he told mourners who live in narrow rooms, right? This is a time also where the Jewish community in Manhattan was heavily concentrated in the Lower East Side, living in tenements still, that they should go out, even if they're sitting Shiva at least once a day to get fresh air, and also that they could buy food and that they should wear shoes. They shouldn't go barefoot. All things that they hoped would help prevent people from catching the flu. So this, and obviously this was something that the newspaper editors also want to spread in the community if they're putting it on the front page. That sort of makes sense, and we can understand, right, why, especially in cramped quarters, it's anyway good for health reasons to get fresh air and to make sure that you're well nourished. So that we can appreciate. There's a much stranger story, though, that appeared in the Winnipeg Evening Tribune on November 11th, 1918, about that's with the title "Hebrews Hold Wedding of Death to Halt Flu." Now, if you look, let me see if I can pull in a little bit, and I'll read this. If you remember, also November 11th, 1918 is Armistice Day, right? It's basically the day World War I ended. So most of the articles in the paper are about that. But there was one article in the back that was about this strange ceremony that took place in Winnipeg. So the article explains that the wedding of death is an ancient Hebrew ceremony established about 2,000 years ago to stay the ravages of a plague. And it was celebrated at the East Kildonian Cemetery this afternoon as a sacrifice to prevent the flu epidemic. Hebrews and Gentiles alike were present to witness the ceremony. It was the first wedding under the old Orthodox religion ever staged in Canada. It was claimed, I'm not exactly sure what that means, prohibited at all other times. The ceremony was held at the orders of Rabbi Kananovich and Rabbi Gorodowski. The wedding was most celebrated and had been planned for more than a month. At one end of the cemetery, a quorum of 10 Jews constituted a funeral, and at the other, 1,600 Gentiles and Jews witnessed the wedding. The ancient Jewish Song of Life was played. On the west side of the cemetery at the same time, Jews were chanting the wail of death as a body was committed to the grave. So there was a funeral going on at the same time this was happening. I think that was actually probably coincidental, because I don't think a funeral is part of this ritual. Harry Beichman and Dora Weissman were the contracting parties of the wedding. Rabbis Kananovich and Gorodowski officiated. Following the ceremony services were conducted by the rabbis. Ancient Jewish chapters reserved for these ceremonies were chanted by the rabbis and repeated by all the Jews present as the wedding procession marched out of the cemetery. And this sounds very strange, but in fact, a very similar black wedding, as it was referred to, or a wedding of death, as they say here, was reported to have happened at the end of October in Philadelphia, also in a Jewish cemetery. And this, I do not believe this ritual is 2,000 years old. I think it's developed also in the time of the Middle Ages, probably around the time Jewish communities were dealing with the plague then. And basically what it involved was taking people, holding a wedding for generally two orphans or people who were otherwise in some way seen as being disadvantaged, and doing it in a place where, I'm not sure if the cemetery was associated with it being a plague or because the people were orphans and that way their parents could be present. But essentially the idea was you lavishly celebrated, I think, the wedding of two disadvantaged people in the community. At the same time, you beg God to intercede and stop the plague as a way of, with our chesed, or the community's chesed, trying to then, hoping that the chesed the community shows for people who are less fortunate within it will cause God to show chesed, to show kindness to the world, to the Jewish community, and stop the plague. So obviously, this is not a ritual that we think about regularly. It's actually not something that I knew much about until I was putting this together. But it seems like it was invoked in Jewish communities, certainly across North America, in the fall of 1918. And along the other articles that, there are a number of other articles in this paper also that talk about how people think that the epidemic is near its peak. And of course, we know that that wasn't exactly true because the epidemic went on for another year almost. But so that was also, people thought it was peaking and it wasn't. So that was also sort of, as I was flipping through the pages of this, trying to find in this article, also sort of resonated and something perhaps we can relate to. So those are some thoughts about from the Spanish, some ways Jewish communities responded to the Spanish flu. More generally, questions have developed with the rise, especially of modern medicine, and as medicine has gotten better, about how to best treat people. What do you do if you have a limited numbers of supplies, medical supplies, and multiple people come in to the hospital at once, needing care? How do you decide who gets the treatment and who doesn't? And this was this tshuva we'll see from Moshe Feinstein was written long before COVID, but obviously this came up and was a big discussion especially in New York in late March and April, where there was a real concern that they might run out of ventilators. Okay, so let's see what Rav Moshe says about this question of triaging people. So he says, the case you pose, he was asked the question, concerns two patients who were brought into the hospital, both in need of emergency care. And one of them has a good possibility of being cured, but it's not absolutely certain that he needs the intensive treatment, although this would be the preferred method of treatment. However, the second patient for whom the intensive care could only provide a postponement of death cannot live at all without the attention of an emergency intervention. Which patient should be given the only bed available? So actually the question he's asking is not in a case where both people are certainly going to die. He says there's a case where someone is coming in and you can prolong their life, but you can't save them. And then you have someone who comes in, let's say at the same time, who is in a position of safek pekuach nefesh. They might be in a life-threatening situation, or they might not. And you might be able to say they might be able to live even if they don't get this type of immediate care or intensive care, or they might not. How do you decide who gets the limited resources you have? So he writes that, in my opinion, if both arrive at the same time, the decision should be made on the basis of medical suitability. The one who has the best chance of being treated and cured should be given the available bed. However, if the one who can only live, okay, so that sort of makes sense, right? So both patients come in the door at the same moment. You treat the one who you think is going to have the best chances of survival. That makes sense. I also think it's important to think about just this term medical suitability. It's something that comes up in Shuvot, rabbinic responses that deal with medical situations a lot. Oftentimes, rabbis will emphasize that we are not doctors, and that what we can give you sort of parameters of how you make decisions, but not what the correct decision always is. Actually, I saw that Rav Aviner was asked a question sort of similar to this. Rav Aviner is one of the leading poskim in the religious Zionist world in Israel, and he said that rabbis can't make medical decisions. They shouldn't make military decisions. They shouldn't make economic decisions. They can talk broadly sort of about military ethics, medical ethics, economic ethics, right? The sort of parameters that you should think about. But ultimately, it's up to the doctors to decide how to sort of put those ethical categories into action. Okay, so let's continue. Let's keep going. However, if the one who can only live for a short time has already begun treatment before the arrival of the second patient, for whom there's an expectation of cure, but he can only be saved if the first patient, whose life can only be prolonged for a short time, is removed, it's still forbidden to interrupt the treatment of the first patient in order to save them. The logic is obvious. The individual who can live only a short time is not obligated to forfeit his life for anyone else once he has taken possession of the hospital facility and his life depends on continued treatment, even if his life expectancy is but a short duration. His claim takes precedence over all other claims. I see this as a contractual relationship between the hospital and the physicians. So here, instead of the sort of first scenario that Rav Moshe painted, it's a little bit different now. The two patients don't come in the door at the same time. They come in, the patient whose life can only be prolonged but not saved came in first, but is already hooked up to the life-sustaining treatment. At that point, the second patient comes in. It doesn't really matter how much longer later, but they come in later. They can be saved, perhaps fully saved and returned to full health if they are hooked up to this life-saving equipment. That you can't remove that first patient in order to save the second patient's life, he says. And this is sort of similar to what we often comes up in end-of-life discussions in Judaism, which is that it's very hard in halacha to ever remove someone from life-sustaining equipment, to take someone off of a ventilator. You don't have to use you don't have to take heroic measures to save someone's life, but once an intervention is made, it's only under very rare circumstances can you withdraw care. And this certainly fits with what Rav Moshe is saying here. Okay, the care they provided, continuing, the care they provided was assigned to this terminally ill patient, and no one can take it away from him. The patient himself is not required to give it up to the patient who can be cured. And he's possibly not even permitted to do so voluntarily, right? You can't say, you can't sort of say, like we see in those movies sometimes, take my life, to free the captive. You can't decide to give up your life to save someone else's. So it's not even clear that if the patient were awake, that he could choose, that he would be allowed to voluntarily ask for himself to be removed either. However, as noted, in the case where they both arrive at the hospital at the same time, the selection of the patient more medically suited for treatment, that's the one who's going to have the better outcome, should be made even if the first patient, for whom there is no hope of actual cure, arrives first. So in other words, in this case, it seems like they don't both arrive at the hospital at the same time, but the patient whose life can only be prolonged but will not ultimately be healed, even if he gets there first, if he's not hooked up to the equipment already, then you go back to the one who has the best long-term prognosis. The one with the better chance of survival should be treated. The only time he should not be given preference is when the patient who has no hope of a cure has actually begun his treatment. Right? So long as you can't remove care from someone, even from someone with a poor prognosis, to give it to someone with a better prognosis, you can't remove some sort of life-saving intervention. But so long as that intervention hasn't taken place, then you can give it and choose to give it to the person who has the best long-term prognosis. Another important consideration that Rav Moshe deals with here that also received some discussion recently is the question of age. We know, especially in COVID-19, that typically it impacts people are in high-risk categories, both if they have certain underlying conditions, but also if they're older than 65 or 70. As people get older, the mortality rate increases. And Rav Moshe dealt with this question not in the context of COVID-19, but in regards to just distributing medical treatment in general. He said that age should be of no factor in triage considerations, right? You can't say in his case that you could, if you have two patients in front of you. Well, let me read Rav Moshe and then I'll explain it. I'm jumping the gun. Age is no factor in triage considerations. Preference must not be given to a younger patient over an older patient. The only acceptable criteria is medical suitability, not length of survival. For survival is in the hands of Hashem and has to do with the individual's ordained lifespan. Although it's obvious that a 20-year-old patient can live longer than a 90-year-old patient, both must be treated exactly the same way when they are presented for treatment. The age factor must be discounted completely in all medical decisions. So Rav Moshe is saying here is that you look at someone's prognosis, right? The likelihood that they'll recover. And obviously if someone has the medical suitability should be about who's most likely to recover. Not about, well, this patient is 90 and this patient is 20, so we're going to say, well, the patient who is 20 has 50 more good years ahead of him, God willing, and the patient who is 90 might not. So we're just going to automatically give the intervention to the younger patient. He says that's not how this is done. That this is only done based on the prognosis for recovery, and age and life expectancy should not come into play. Any questions up to this point? Okay. So now let's look at a question that came up specifically about COVID-19. So this is from Rav Herschel Schachter, who is one of the Rosh Yeshiva University, probably the foremost and most widely respected posek in the modern Orthodox, centrist Orthodox community today in America. So part of what he says here, he was also asked about triage and rationing care, and then a complicated question specifically about ventilators. So he was asked as well, are you allowed to hook up multiple people to one ventilator, even if it will, and can you take someone who was hooked up, who was the only patient on one ventilator, and add another patient to that ventilator, if it is somehow going to negatively impact the care of the first patient. So we'll see the beginning of this. He reaffirms what Rav Moshe says, and then he deals specifically with this complicated question. Now, ventilators are, as far as I know, not designed to have more than one patient on them, at least generally speaking. But when in certain hospitals that faced a ventilator shortage at certain points in April, they did hook up multiple patients for a little while to a singular ventilator, and they sort of jerry-rigged it to make it work. But obviously, as you can imagine, that means the care is less individualized, and perhaps also then air is being transferred from one patient to another. So let's see what Rav Schachter says. This is a summary. He wrote this tshuva in Hebrew. It was lengthy, so I didn't want to translate the whole thing. But there are some points. We'll read the summary, and then there are two key sections that I wanted us to see inside that I translated. Okay, so Rav Schachter says that if two people arrive at the same time, and the hospital has only one ventilator, you give it to the one with the better chance to survive. Okay, that's very similar to what Rav Moshe said. And he continues like Rav Moshe. However, once someone is hooked up to a respirator or a ventilator, one cannot take him off of it to give it to someone else. You cannot end someone's life to save another. You can't push off one person's life for another's. If initially each patient is hooked up to his own ventilator, but the doctors know that as more cases arrive, they will have to move them around such that multiple patients share one ventilator, this is permissible. Even if a patient has a better chance of survival on his exclusive ventilator than when sharing with another patient. And he says this explicitly. Let's say, for example, his chance of survival dropped by 15% or so. you can still do this. You can take a patient who used to have his own ventilator and add another patient to it in order to give more people a better chance of survival. The Torah gives doctors permission and responsibility to make their best effort according to the best current medical knowledge to save people. So, for example, if hospitals took 4 patients up to 1 respirator due to a shortage of ventilators in an effort to save as many lives as possible, even though it is possible that one of those patients will end up being worse off for having shared the same ventilator as other patients, since the doctor's efforts are intended and focused on saving as many lives as possible and they are not intending to harm any of the patients, the doctors are permitted and obligated to do their best, right? So even though perhaps that initial patient who was better off being on his own ventilator and he, God forbid, might die or have worse outcomes because of this, it's still permitted because the doctors are trying to save as many lives as possible. They're not trying to cause this patient harm or hasten his death or anything like that. Ultimately, they want to heal him as well, but they're trying to heal as many people as possible. So I just want to read that part inside. I cut and paste the Hebrew. We don't have to look at the Hebrew, but it's there if you want to see it. But I thought this was a really sort of nice formulation of that was worth us seeing about how he thinks of what medical treatment is all about and what, especially under stressful, extreme circumstances. So he says, we learn this from the verse, Rapo Yerapeh, that you shall surely heal. The Torah gave permission for us to try to heal. And this is explained by the Ramban to mean that even though it's possible that doctors will inadvertently hasten a patient's death because of their treatment, everything they did was in order to heal that person. And the Torah gave doctors permission to heal as best as they are able. Right? So even if doctors make them do something and it inadvertently causes a patient to die, it's still covered by this mitzvah that you should certainly try to heal. Right? It doesn't constitute any sort of transgression. Medical understanding grows greatly, Rav Schechter says, in every generation. And each generation, patients were treated according to the best of their knowledge, the best of the doctor's knowledge. Nevertheless, many patients died prematurely because of their treatments, right? We know throughout history, I think even in 1918, I saw a source somewhere that said doctors really didn't know what to do, so some people suggested bloodletting for the Spanish flu, which I'm sure did not help. But the people were trying to do the best that they could. And he says, nevertheless, many patients died prematurely throughout the ages because of doctors were simply using the medical wisdom that they had at their disposal. Yet all these treatments were included in the Torah's injunction that you should surely heal. And so the Torah doesn't demand the doctors that they know everything about medicine that will be known for all time or will be known for the future. Right? It says Rav Schechter says the Torah's injunction when it comes to healing is that you use the best medical wisdom at your disposal to make the decisions that are going to maximize your chances of saving life and put those into place. And that might mean that, God forbid, some people are actually worse off or that some people die. But because you're trying to save the most number of people, you're not trying to cause or hasten anyone's death, that you're actually fulfilling this mitzvah of Rapo Yerapeh, that you shall certainly heal. So let's see. Now let's just take a look at the end here. Okay. So Rav Schechter concludes this tshuva by writing, it appears that in our present situation, it appears that in our present situation, we consider all the patients as if they arrived at the same time. And certainly we are obligated to treat all of them in a balanced way and to save all it is possible to save. And connecting multiple patients to one ventilator does not constitute pushing off one life for the sake of another, right? It's not the same as removing care from someone to give it to someone else. And does not transgress the prohibition of you shall not murder, but if one does this in order to save others, if one hooks up multiple patients to a singular ventilator. rather, this is done in order to treat all that are there in a manner that will make it possible to save all that we are able to save. So that's ultimately that's Rav Schechter's opinion in this case, is that you can do this. And as I mentioned, that was actually something that some hospitals used, certainly in the New York area, for a short period of time. So now I want to transition to vaccines, unless anyone has any questions about that. Okay, so let's take a look at some discussion about vaccines. The first halachic work that dealt, as far as I know, with vaccines was written in the late 18th century, in the 1780s in Germany. And it was written by a rabbi who I believe did not publish greatly or much else, actually. But he published one work encouraging people to, and encouraging the use of the smallpox inoculation. Now, the smallpox vaccine was sort of discovered by accident, right? I think the name of the person who's credited was discovering it as Jensen, if I'm not mistaken. But basically what he noticed was that people who were exposed to cowpox tended to be resistant to smallpox. That there was a sort of cross resistance, and that cowpox was very mild. I think the story is that he sort of noticed like the milkmaids, the girls at the dairy farm who were in charge of milking the cows would often get cowpox and then were not susceptible to smallpox. So he sort of theorized if there was a way of giving people a small amount of the smallpox virus, then perhaps, even though he had no real understanding of viruses on any sort of microscopic level, then or if you could give people the virus under sort of controlled conditions, then you would prevent you could prevent people from getting a more severe case later on. So Avraham ben Shlomo writes this work in the late 18th century, encouraging people to get inoculated. He writes very movingly in the work that he lost 2 children to smallpox, which is part of why he feels passionately about it. But there's some debate about it amongst the rabbinic authorities in the early 19th century, partly because even though the mortality rate from smallpox was very high, they didn't really know what they were doing with inoculation either, right? They didn't have the necessary scientific, or let's say biological chemistry understanding about how it worked. So it was sort of trial and error with the inoculation, which also meant some people got quite sick from the inoculation. And so there was some pushback against it as well. But the Tiferet Israel, Rav Yisrael Lifshitz, who lived in the early 19th century, in his commentary on the Mishnah, comes out very strongly in 2 places actually in favor of the inoculation. In one, he praises the discoverer, and then over here, it's the Mishnah in Yoma, I'm missing part of the citation. He writes, and from this it seems to me that one can derive that it is permissible to perform a smallpox inoculation, even though 1 of 1,000 dies because of the inoculation. Right, so there is some mortality rate, he says, from the inoculation. Nevertheless, the pox enters. If the pox enters his body naturally, the danger is greater, and therefore one's permitted to place himself in a situation of small danger in order to save himself from a more likely danger or a greater danger later on. And this also fits with something else we discussed last week. We were about can you place yourself in danger to save someone else? It's very clear that you certainly can place yourself. In fact, you're obligated to place yourself in a small amount of danger, where there's a small amount of risk to your life in order to save someone who is at great risk. And that the only times where you don't place yourself in danger is where those risks are comparable. So this fits with that as well, that even when it comes to yourself, you can place yourself in a place where there's a small risk to your life in order to avoid a much greater risk to your life later on. So that's the Tiferet Israel writing in the early 19th century. And smallpox largely over time gets eradicated through the use of the vaccine and the inoculation. Okay, so let's jump ahead now to some very contemporary works on discussing vaccines. So the Nishmat Avraham is one of probably the most important contemporary work about halachic medical ethics. And he speaks to a wide variety of poskim in it. It's several volumes long. It's the go-to work for medical ethics. So he mentions a conversation. He discusses vaccines in his Choshen Mishpat volumes, and he writes, although the presently recommended regime for vaccinations is of great benefit to both the child and the community, some parents are frightened of the very small risk involved. So Rav Newert, who was a Talmid of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, here it says Shlita, he's since passed away, told me that because of this fear, they cannot be forced to have their child vaccinated, even though halachically they should be strongly advised to do so. So it's a little bit of confusing, actually, what his Rav Newert's psak here is. But he says that basically they can't be compelled to do so because of their fear. And also, it seems very clear that for both Shlomo Zalman and for Rav Newert is that part of the other factor that they're considering is that it's highly unlikely that any one individual will contract something that we now have vaccines for because of herd immunity. Of course, I think there's a certain weakness to that logic, and I'm not the only one who does. Rav Asher Weiss, one of the great, probably foremost posek for medical ethics alive today, really makes this argument. So we'll see that in a second. But let's see the end of this. So he says you can't force them to be vaccinated, but a doctor should advise them strongly to do so. And this also applies to immunization, for example, against hepatitis and smallpox. So also, Newert wrote elsewhere that one may not obligate any healthy person to receive treatment as a preventive measure, although one may try to convince the individual, he may do no more. Again, you can't compel someone. But if there was absolute evidence that an individual could be a danger to others, such as spreading infection, which could be fatal, then there would be a case for forcing him to have a vaccine, but only if it was certain the vaccine itself was not dangerous to him. So I don't know what level of certainty, I don't know if he's saying it has to be 100% safe, or it has to be safe it only has to be dangerous to 1 in 1,000. I'm not sure exactly what that means. But clearly here there is a sense that he's playing with the statistics as well, because it's very unlikely that anyone is going to contract it, or if they do contract it, it's very unlikely that anyone will spread it because most people are immunized. That's part of the reason he doesn't think you can force people. This is, though, a big, very controversial amongst the poskim. So let's see what Rav Asher Weiss says. Certainly, he writes that one is obligated to undergo a procedure that entails some risk in order to treat a disease that is liable to place him in great danger. The disagreement was only about the parameters of the principle that one places his own life ahead of another's life. But it is obvious that all would agree that when it comes to his own life, he's obligated to place himself in a remote danger in order to save himself from approximate danger. And that's almost verbatim what the Tiferet Israel said that we saw. Likewise, in the present case, a person is obligated to vaccinate his children because vaccination is not dangerous at all except in extraordinarily rare cases, whereas lack of vaccination endangers those very children. This is all the more certain given that lack of vaccination constitutes public endangerment. And then he continues, it's indeed true that since the vast majority of children and adults in modern society have been vaccinated, these diseases have become exceedingly rare. Therefore, it would seem that there are grounds for parents to claim that they should not endanger their children through vaccination, causing them pain and side effects, when the expected risk of non-vaccination is so minuscule. However, if we allow these parents not to vaccinate the children, their results would be entirely predictable. Many would refrain from vaccinating their children, motivated by maternal compassion and paternal love. And then the great danger of outbreaks of disease would emerge once again. Therefore, refraining from vaccination is not permitted in any way. In truth, I've ruled year in and year out that there's an obligation to vaccinate children for this very reason, right? So Rav Moshe Weiss feels very strongly that there's a halachic obligation for people to both get vaccinated themselves as well as vaccinate their children. And that you can't, he rejects Rav Shlomo Zalman's argument about that sort of relate to the statistics, whereas Rav Shlomo Zalman said people should be vaccinated, but because some people are nervous, we're going to take that in consideration. We're not going to force them because it's very low risk. He says, well, that really would only work if 90% of the population still gets vaccinated. And if you tell people that they don't have to, then perhaps more people won't, and then we'll be in a case of real sakana, of real danger, where we have outbreaks of disease again. And Rav Elyashiv, who just passed away very recently, but was the preeminent Ashkenazi Haredi posek for many years in Israel, said something similar. So Rav Akiva Tatz, who's a very well-known sort of outreach and kiruv personality, as well as someone who's written a lot on medical ethics, has a book on Jewish medical ethics. So he mentions this discussion with Rabbi Elyashiv, and he writes, the question was put to Rabbi Elyashiv, who ruled that the parents should accede to immunization despite their concerns. This is like the very same question about what to do if parents are afraid. When asked if the reason behind this ruling was the issue of fairness and an obligation to share responsibility, Rav Elyashiv indicated that it was. His reason was that since immunization of children is normal practice throughout the world, one should follow that normative practice. In fact, Rav Elyashiv went so far as to assert that the failure to immunize would amount to negligence. Refusing childhood immunization on the basis of unsubstantiated fears of vaccine side effects is irresponsible and out of order halachically. The danger of precipitating epidemics of measles, poliomyelitis, and other diseases with potentially devastating complications is far more real than dangers attributed to vaccines on the basis of anecdotal claims. Until objective evidence to the contrary accrues, the halakhically correct approach is to do what is normal. So it seems like for Rebbe Elyashiv that if you assume in the case of something like a medical treatment, that if it's widely adopted and is seen as being normative, then whatever risks it may pose are regarded as being small enough that one should, that those risks do not constitute a reason not to undergo that treatment or not to be immunized. And in fact, he seems to imply that not being immunized is somehow sort of evading one's communal responsibility, in a very similar way to what Rav Moshe Weiss said as well. So that is where I will leave this subject, I think, for now. But basically, what we've seen so far, one is that beginning in 1918, rabbis really, and perhaps even before that in some ways, right, rabbis were aware of non-medical interventions that might be necessary to halt illness and disease, both things that we would now refer to as social distancing or just public health measures. Some of them they encourage people to employ in terms of, and were lenient about, encourage people to be lenient when it came to certain laws of Shiva. I think also I read about shuls across the country were closed for a time due to the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918. I actually think there's a story in one that I encountered about one of the shuls in Cleveland where the police showed up to close it down. So we know that went on as well. Sometimes they were closed voluntarily. Sometimes they had to be encouraged. Also, though, throughout Jewish history, there's also been a reliance on beseeching God for mercy to and to intercede at a time of epidemics and outbreaks of disease. Sometimes this took the form of things we're familiar with, tefillot, fasting, and other times it took the form rituals that we're less familiar with, the wedding ritual that was reported in the Winnipeg paper. But the key ingredient to that, I think, when you separate yourself or step back from the fact that it's very strange that they're holding a wedding in a cemetery, is that they're doing it as an expression of communal chesed. And the hope is that if God sees us acting kindly to one another, he'll intercede and act kindly with the world. And then finally, as we move through the 20th century, poskim are forced to deal with very difficult issues about how you apportion medical care. And very recently, Rav Schechter had to deal with this question of, can you perhaps negatively impact someone's long-term prognosis, because it will allow you to hopefully save others? Very challenging question that he says we can do, and in fact we must, and that because we do the best that we can. Every generation does the best that they can with the medical wisdom at their disposal. And finally, and I think in that vein also, the poskim answered the question about vaccines. Certainly, that's what Rav Elyashiv says, that you deal with what's normative for your time, and you go from there, and that there's a obligation to share the burdens of public health and to take part in all public health measures to keep everyone in the community safe. I don't know, so I'll stop there. I don't know if anyone has any questions.